Okay, it's 9 o'clock. We start with Ton, our next keynote speaker. He's talking about openness and reuse of data. And he named himself as one of the only persons or speakers that might not be connected too deep to our geo community. So after his talk, I'm sure you're around here for some time. So please, if you have questions, contact him later. It's your time.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Till avoided saying my last name because it was too hard. But my name is Ton Zijlstra. And I've been working on open data, especially open government data, in the past 8 years or so, helping governments open data up and reusers using that data. You find my contact info at the bottom of the sheet there, Twitter handle. I hadn't quite prepared for IRC being available here. It shows you it's a technologists conference when there's an IRC channel. And there's a URL there where I will later post the slides, which is the greenall.eu FOSFOR-G. When I was approached to speak here, I was given a choice for a time slot. And I thought, I won't speak immediately after lunch because that usually is the graveyard shift. And then, I was sort of slotted for this morning, and I saw on the program that yesterday evening there was this boat gala party on the Rhine, and I thought maybe I should have opted for the after lunch slot. So I'm really pleased that you're here. Thank you for coming after the party that you went to last night. And I thought maybe then I should use this time not to explain to you a whole lot about open data, but try to give you a couple of challenges to wake you up for the rest of the day. When we talk about open data, it usually is in terms of let's get more data out. And we've been doing that for a long time. In the geo sector, it's been going on for decades and decades. In other areas, maybe less long. And over time, we've seen the release of massive amounts of government data all over the world, basically, from the very small to much larger data sets. And especially here in Europe, the push for that, the reason why governments were getting on board of this was because they had been promised truckloads of money. 200 billion euros a year in economic impact of opening that data up. And the reason that the European Commission especially pushes this economic perspective on open data is because they have a mandate to arrange the single market. And then it's really hard to talk about social aspects, enabling citizens to deal with their government more effectively, or transparency. So this economic push on open data comes from this single market perspective. And yes, we've seen lots of data being released. We've seen it reused. Also from the very mundane, in the Netherlands we have an app called the Rain Radar, which is something that every Dutchman uses when they get on their bike to check, will I stay dry until I get to my destination, which is a very mundane reuse of government data, to the more novel and the more sort of speaking to the imagination, which is what Google Translate does with all the boring documents that the European Commission creates, because the European collection of documents is the largest body of very precisely translated documents in 23 languages, and they're ideal to train your translation algorithms with. So we see all this reuse. But when I talk to governments, when I talk to local governments specifically, they say, where are those 200 billion that we've been promised? Where is that impact? Because especially to regional and local governments, what is the relationship between sort of the handful of spreadsheets that they publish to the 200 billion euros that they thought they were going to generate for their local economies, so to speak? And it seems to me that this sort of focus on the type of impact that they're looking for, economic impact, more jobs, more turnover, more tax revenue, seems to be taking away the proper view of where that impact is being generated. So when we talk about the impact of reusing data that has been opened up, are we looking in the right places? Or are we looking in the wrong places? To be sure, there is strong economic impact of open data reuse, but even then it can still be extremely hard to spot. With our company, we've been doing a number of microeconomic studies into the effects of opening up data, and one of them was looking at icebreakers in the Botnian Gulf around Finland. And they used satellite imagery to spot where the ice is thinnest, and so what are the most effective routes and the cheapest routes in terms of fuel to get stuff into harbor. And the direct impact of that on those icebreakers is already significant, but it's not where the real story is. The real story only emerges if you then follow the entire chain, the value chain of goods from the ships getting into harbor in Finland, how that impacts the logistics change, because with using this data, it becomes more predictable when the goods arrive, until finally supermarket prices in the north of Finland go down. But that's a long, long causal chain with many network effects. And it takes a load of time and a load of effort to map all that out, to find out where those connections are. But if you do, you find very significant impact and direct impact on people doing shopping in the north of Finland and the type of foodstuffs that they can get. But nobody really bothers doing these type of studies because they're too intensive. It's too much work to do this, and you can only do this for specific contexts. So looking in the right places for impact is actually hard. It is also hard when we look at impacts that are much smaller. This is a small project in Amsterdam by a group called Budget Monitoring. And what they do with neighbors in a neighborhood is map out all the financial flows from government into a city neighborhood. This is local government, national government, regional governments, all the money that they pump into a specific neighborhood. And usually we as citizens don't know. You probably don't know what your local government is spending in your city, in your neighborhood on maintaining the green zones in the parks. You probably don't know what they're spending on specific projects in your neighborhood community center. So they mapped all this out, and for the first time this enabled an equal conversation between everybody, all those neighbors together, to discuss, do we think that this money is being well spent? Do we think that this money could be more effective in a different place? And as a result of that, these people took over their own community center, created 3 jobs along the way. They now sending out people to other places to train other neighborhoods on how to get this data and use it to their own advantage in their own neighborhood. And again, this is significant impact. This is real impact. It is changing the relationships between neighbors, it's changing the relationships between citizens and their government. It's real impact, but it's hard to spot because it takes effort to go into this specific context and ask, how are you using this data? And that makes the impact of open data really hard to see and makes it stand a long way off of the 200 billion euros that our governments had been promised. So most of the governments that I work with, they apparently expected, and maybe we all did, that there was an easy fix to spot this impact. But we've grown to realize that if we want to see impact, we need to start reasoning from where we wanted that impact in the first place. Only if you know where you want to drive impact, you can choose, okay, this is the data that is connected to those issues, let's release that. And because you know what you're looking for, if then there is an impact, it will be easier to spot. And this, to me, is a key intrinsic motivator for releasing data, not just by governments, but also by companies. Is where do you want to achieve impact, and can you then release the data that might enable others to get that impact for you? And it's about building these sort of feedback loops between issues, stakeholders, and the data. And when you do that, you get very surprising results. We've worked with 9 local governments and a regional government in the Netherlands, saying, okay, what are the issues that you're dealing with? And these municipal governments come with very different things. One said, we have a lot of flash flooding after heavy rainfall. Others said, we have shops standing empty. A third one said, we want to enable entrepreneurs in socially disadvantaged neighborhoods more. And then we started discussing with them, so what's the data that might be connected to it, and release that. And then you see forms of reuse that do not fit in that sort of big golden promise at the start. Then you get to childcare facilities, daycare facilities that are starting to use data to better understand, what next year's cohort of children in the neighborhood will be, how they are divided along different ethnicities and the type of languages that you probably need in your organization. Then you get to people like the guy on the left, top left, which is a farmer called Ben in the north of the Netherlands. And he does the most cliche thing you can think of in the Netherlands, which is showing tourists tulips. And so he organizes little tours across his fields to show the tulip fields. And he realized that he wanted to enrich those tours. And he approached his local government saying, what do you know about the region? Historic features, archaeological digs, pubs, restaurants that I can connect to. And he is one of the more avid users of open data in a very small rural community, and changing sort of the tourism sector in his village single-handedly. In those type of settings, you get real impact, but it takes focusing, starting with real issues, diving into the real contexts, and then release the data across that. And we've been trying to do that with civil servants across many local governments. We call them data trips. And we start asking, what is it that you do on a daily basis? Who are you trying to reach in your community? And can you use the data as an enabler for new conversations and new action? But it does mean one thing. It means that we maybe need to step away from the more shiny open data projects that we see. There's other cities that try to work with the local universities, and they have far-flung future visions of smart cities and big data explorations and analysis programs that are completely disconnected from the real issues that play a role in those cities, completely disconnected of the issues that the citizens have. So if we want to use data to create real impact, societal impact, we need to release data that is connected to it. And if we want to deal with serious issues, that means releasing lots of serious data. And there too, in reality, we see a gap. We see lots of tree lists being published by governments. But when we want to establish beneficial ownership of companies in our countries, we need to turn to things like Panama Papers. Even though the bigger felt issues are in that second area and not in the first area. If we want to create real impact with the data that we already have because we've collected it, and create impact by reusing it, we need to attach it to, need to release the data that's connected to the real issues. Not just for governments, but also for companies and sectors, especially the sectors that are closely tied to the public interest. Utilities, foods, production and safety, financing, those sectors need to come on board with that too. And that data needs to be open. It cannot be just data, because the data is already there, it's not achieving that impact now, so it needs to be open to do that. And the reason it can achieve impact when it's open is because of what we see when we remove barriers to reuse. Once you open up data, you see that there's a nonlinear growth in the number of people that actually use it. And we see that time and time again. This is a repeating pattern. This is a graph of the German statistics agency. They stopped charging for data somewhere in 2008, and you can spot in the graph where that happened. Immediately there's a nonlinear jump in the amount of people interested in downloading the data and looking at it. Then you see sort of a slump, probably because everybody's trying to figure out now what can we do with this stuff, and then it goes up further. But this is a repeating pattern. Time and again, new people come in when you release data. This is another example of that, Transport for London. They released all the data on where the tubes run and sort of the trains. And what they've seen is that as soon as they did so, over 5,000 people started engaging with the data sets, creating around 500 different applications with it along the way, ranging from somebody who had a monitor on his desk, alerting him to when the next bus will stop in front of his office so that he can run out and catch it, to very intricate planning applications for the entire city. So what we see is that new impact with open data reuse is often driven by these new users that come in if you open up the data and remove the barriers. It's the new stakeholders that come to the table that you're enabling to act. And that's where the impact comes from. It's also coming from new agencies, new ways to act from existing stakeholders. And that's something that we see with government itself. Governments are their own biggest reusers when you open up the data. To the extent that the city of Manchester books in multiple millions of savings every year because now their own people know where they can find the data and information that they would like to work with, and it was very hard to get at that data internally before. Now, if we know that it's about bringing more people to the table, more eyes on the data, that means that in the term open data, open is the most important part. And we're all technologists, so we tend to focus on the data bit, building the stuff and creating the tools. But open is the more important part here. Without that, nothing really happens. Then we have what we already have. And there's an issue there, because I see loads of government bodies trying to retract from their previous open data steps, because they're finding out that it's actually hard to engage with new stakeholders, to have new conversations and build new relationships. That costs time and effort. And they're much more comfortable in dealing with the organizations, the companies, the stakeholders that they're already dealing with. So what you see in cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam that have been trying to be on the forefront of open data as local governments, they're now sort of retracting their steps. Because it's easier to just share data with a selective few when you know what you're trying to do with the data. It's much more interesting to call it big data, keep it all for yourself, not work on information symmetry, but use it as a way to get a sort of an information advantage. And this is a real danger, that because it's hard to deal with new interaction, new relationships, new stakeholders, you retract into, okay, let's just focus on the data because we're comfortable there. Openness is the key word here, and we need to stay focused on that. That means that we need to defend this principle of openness, and that's why I would like being here, because open is one of the key elements of what you're here for, or what you are here for too. There's one other thing, that when we do this openness well, it will become less visible. When openness becomes open by design, anything that we can publish along our processes is being automatically published. It becomes less visible, because then it's just the way that we work. Right until now, openness is still an additional feature, so we can sort of, hey, look at me, I'm doing openness. But when it's the way that we do things, it becomes less visible. And again, that sort of is a risk in itself, because then we maybe are not as aware that we need to defend that. One of the areas where you see that, this is a Dutch province. They publish all their geodata, but it's also the only way that they communicate with contractors for maintenance on the roads. This is the way that they provide information. It's the same information that everybody else gets, and they push it out. And contractors, the maintenance crews, they go here. It's not a separate system as they had before. So doing openness well, paradoxically, might mean that we lose track of it, that we don't see it anymore. A second area where I think this question as to where is the impact, where are the 200 billion, where are they? The second aspect of why it's not clear is that there's a lot of fragmentation in the type of data that is available. We see disparate types of data sets, various topics, sectors being published, but quite often you can't really use that, because the value comes from combining 4 or 5 different data sets, and you can only find one for the time period or the geographic area that you're interested, and the other 4 are simply not available yet. So that makes it hard to reuse it. We've seen the release of educational data in the Netherlands. It took 7 years for the first mature application to arise on top of that data. And it was for lack of surrounding data that you could use to combine it with. Now, luckily, we see in several countries that there's an effort to build something like a national data infrastructure. And these tend to contain the data sets that are key to public service, the data sets that they use on a daily basis, or sort of big data sets that you can use to combine and contextualize the smaller ones. And where this becomes possible, where you have this sort of backbone of core data sets about the area where you live, the country or the continent where you're at, then it becomes much easier to do all these different combinations and build value on top of that. And that brings me to geodata, because geographic data is one of the sort of key elements in those national data infrastructures. And that makes geodata the linking pin for many other uses of open data. And that comes with special questions, because it creates a couple of effects. One is that because of having geodata as a linking pin to combine different others, we are actually building sort of the biggest data set of all. So that sort of should reassure the city government of Amsterdam that there is also big data and open data. And we see that this combination is being used to create things like generic APIs, so that you have one entry point for all that sort of diverse data set. That's one role where Geo is at the heart, sort of creating a place where through one entry point you can sort of look at the whole. But there's also different ways in which Geo as a linking pin is seeing its role shift. And one of the more significant ones, I think, is that it used to be when I talked to people in geodata, they said, well, privacy, that's not our concern, because we deal with maps and stuff. And so privacy, we're not about privacy. But when you are the place where everybody combines everything else, you're certainly right smack in the heart of every privacy discussion in the world. And I'm not sure whether we as working with geodata are actually prepared for that. Are we capable as technologists to dive into the questions, the hard questions that come with this? And that's already happening with sort of the standard geodata, but geodata itself, of course, is shifting too. We're changing what a map looks like. We're adding multitudes of sensors. Human beings themselves become objects on the map, and we see everything in real time. This unleashes an enormous amount of ethical questions and privacy questions that we as technologies never had to deal with really before in much the same way. And we see different types of responses to that. One of the ways that organizations try to respond to it is by outsourcing some of the more trickier combinations and the more privacy-sensitive steps in using data, outsource that to the National Statistics Office, because they have more legal maneuvering space to do that. Statistical office have a wide sort of brief, and they can recombine any data that you want, and they might give you back the results of that combination without you having to do what is now an illegal step because of privacy legislation. But it's just sort of a band-aid, basically, for the real questions. So one of my challenges for you today is, if you look at Geo and geodata as being at the core of all these privacy issues, and you extend that beyond privacy to questions as, so if we can combine everything, if we are the generic API to every data set in the world, what does that mean? What do we want to allow people to do? What should be possible? What should not be possible in our tools? Then it's not a question of just privacy by design or openness by design, but the challenge is doing ethics by design. And I think the FOSS4G community is already at the heart in the geo sector, at the heart of where those values that go into these ethical questions of openness, collaboration, and creating value together are already very much present. So you seem to be a logical group to take this on, despite the fact that many of you are technologists. A second way that the role of Geo is shifting is like with when openness becomes the norm. When Geo becomes sort of the heart of every recombination of data sets in basically in the world, then geodata itself will become less visible too. I, as a user of data, am very much accustomed to having maps and sort of visualizations and work with that. But if geodata is just a step, an ingredient along the way to recombine something, then the result I'm interested in may not be geographically sort of relevant. It may not be a map. It may not contain any georeference. And As an example, and of course this one still has a map, that's sort of the paradox, but as an example, the healthcare sector is sort of the most opaque sector in the world, even though most governments spend about a third of their national budget or more on healthcare, but it's the most opaque sector. In the data, there's lots and lots of savings potentials to be found, and you need geographic references to find them. But once you've found them, you no longer need the geographic references to act on them. So geodata is an ingredient in getting there, but not an ingredient in the result, even though for eye candy, you might still build maps. But if you're to become an invisible ingredient in lots of different recombinations of data, what do you want to be as suppliers of geodata? Do you want to be a catalyst, a passive ingredient? That sort of, okay, we aid you and then the result is there. Or do you want to be an ingredient with an attitude? An ingredient that knows what types of values it wants to drive forth into the world, types of values it wants to espouse, and an ingredient that actively engages into the hard questions that come along with combining data sets. And those are the challenges that I would like to send you on your way with for today. Even though it's already been an intensive week, I'd like to add a couple of intensive points to you. That is, ask yourself in the work that you're doing with geographic data, where is the impact that you want to achieve? And are you bringing then your data to the stakeholders that can use it to create that impact? Are you enabling new stakeholders? Are you building new relationships with new people around your data? Help as the Phosphor-G community to keep the focus in the geosector on open data. Openness is the key ingredient. That brings the new people to the table. Phosphor-G, the open source community itself, is very accustomed to these concepts. But we need to actively defend and sort of bring out forth that concept into everything that we do. And not just this openness thing, but use your values to create this pathway to ethics by design. Make geo not a passive part of a different routine. Make it an ingredient with a strong attitude to build collective value. And thereby actively shape the role of geo as the linking pin in the open data in the world, and not just allow it to happen. Make it an active role, and the world will thank you. Thank you very much for your time and attention.